5 creepy prison cellmate tales that you won't believe. I've been in this prison for 7 years, and in that time, I'd had my fair share of cellmates. But none of them were like Carl. When he first got moved into my cell, he seemed like a quiet guy, maybe a little too quiet. He never spoke unless spoken to, and even then, his answers were short. I thought he was just one of those guys who kept to himself. That was until I started hearing the whispers. It would always start at night, after lights out. At first, I thought it was just Carl talking in his sleep, but the more I listened, the clearer the whispers became. They weren't coming from Carl, they were coming from the walls. I could hear them, faint and distant, like the conversation taking place just on the other side of the concrete. At first, I thought I was losing my mind. I tried to ignore it, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. One night, I woke up to find Carl sitting on his bed, staring at the wall. His lips were moving, but no sound was coming out. I asked him what he was doing, but he didn't respond. He just kept staring at the wall, mouthing words I couldn't hear. I tried to shake him out of it, but he snapped at me, his eyes wild and terrified. "They're in the walls," he whispered. "They're trying to get in." From that night on, the whispers became a constant presence. I could hear them during the day, even over the noise of the prison. Carl wouldn't sleep. He just sat there, staring at the walls, listening. He started talking to them, having full conversations with whatever was on the other side. It was like he was slipping away into some kind of madness. One night, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of relief. But then I realized Carl was gone. His bed was empty, the sheets pulled back. I searched the cell, but he wasn't there. The door was still locked, and there was no way he could have left. I called for the guards, but when they arrived, they couldn't find any trace of him. It was like he had just disappeared. I spent the rest of the night staring at the walls, waiting for the whispers to return. But they never did. The next morning, they moved me to another cell. I never saw Carl again. When you've been locked up as long as I have, you start to see things. Or at least, that's what they tell you. I didn't believe it until they put me in with Eddie. Eddie was a lifer, just like me, but he was different. The first thing he asked me when they shoved me into the cell was if I'd seen the shadow man. I thought he was joking, but there was a seriousness in his eyes that made me uneasy. I shrugged it off as another inmate going stir-crazy. But that night, I saw it. A dark shape, barely more than a silhouette, standing in the corner of the cell. I blinked, and it was gone. I didn't mention it to Eddie, didn't want to give him the satisfaction of knowing he got to me. But the next night, I saw it again. And the night after that, every night, the shadow man got closer, moving just a little bit further into the cell. Eddie told me that everyone who stayed in this cell eventually saw him, that the shadow man was looking for something, someone. I asked Eddie who, but he just shook his head and said, "You'll know when he finds you." As the days went by, I started losing sleep. I'd lie awake, staring at the corner, waiting for the shadow man to appear. Eddie didn't seem bothered by it anymore. He'd just lie in his bunk, grinning like he knew something I didn't. I asked him again what the shadow man wanted, but he wouldn't answer. He just kept grinning. Then, one night, I woke up and the shadow man was standing right beside my bed. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It felt like all the air had been sucked out of the room. The figure leaned down, its face inches from mine, and whispered in a voice that sounded like the crackling of dry leaves, "It's time." I blacked out, and when I came to, Eddie was gone. The guards told me he'd been transferred to another facility, but I never saw him again. I was left alone in that cell, but the shadow man didn't leave. Every night, he comes back, standing in the corner, watching me. I didn't want to end up in cell 13. Nobody did. The other inmates whispered about it, said it was cursed. The guards laughed it off, called it superstition. But the day they moved me in there, I knew something was wrong. The air felt colder, heavier. My new cellmate, Tony, was a big guy, covered in tattoos, but there was a look in his eyes that told me he was just as scared as I was. I asked him what was up with the cell, but he wouldn't talk about it. "Just keep your head down and don't listen," he said. I didn't know what he meant, but that night, I found out. As soon as the lights went out, I heard it, a faint scratching sound, like nails on concrete. It was coming from the other side of the wall. I tried to ignore it, but it got louder, more insistent. I turned to Tony, but he had his head buried under his pillow, his hands covering his ears. I got up to bang on the wall, thinking maybe it was some kind of prank. But when I touched it, I felt something cold and wet. I pulled my hand back and saw it was covered in something dark, like whole blood. The scratching stopped, but the whispers started. I couldn't make out the words, but they were coming from everywhere, all around us. Tony started to scream, rocking back and forth on his bed, muttering under his breath. I tried to shake him out of it, but he just kept screaming, "Make it stop! Make it stop!" The guards came and took him away, and I was left alone in the cell. The scratching and whispers continued every night, growing louder and more desperate. I tried to block them out, but they were in my head, filling my thoughts with madness. One night, I woke up to find the walls covered in strange symbols drawn in that same dark substance. The guards didn't believe me. They said I was going crazy, just like all the others. I begged them to move me, but they said there was nowhere else to go, so I'm stuck here in cell 13, listening to the whispers and the scratching, waiting for whatever's on the other side to come through. And I know, deep down, that it's only a matter of time before I lose my mind, just like Tony and the others before him. They say prison changes you, but for me, it's the people in here that do the most damage. I never had a cellmate until they moved Danny in with me. He was young, maybe 19, but there was something off about him. He never talked much, just kept to himself, always fiddling with the lock on our cell door. I didn't think much of it at first, just figured he was trying to pass the time. But then one night, I woke up to the sound of the cell door clicking open. I jumped up, thinking we were being broken out, but Danny was just standing there, staring at the open door. I asked him what he was doing, and he just smiled and said, "It's open now." I didn't know what he meant, but I wasn't about to leave my cell and get shot by the guards. I tried to pull him back, but he slipped out of my grasp and disappeared down the hallway. I called out to him, but he was gone. The door swung shut, locking me in. I banged on the door, shouting for the guards, but no one came. I spent the rest of the night alone, staring at the door, waiting for Danny to come back. The next morning, the guards came to check on us and found the door locked tight. I tried to explain what had happened, but they didn't believe me. They said Danny had been transferred weeks ago, that I'd been alone in that cell the whole time. But I knew what I saw. Danny had been there, and he had opened the door, no matter what the guards or anybody says. I know Danny had been there and opened the door. The first thing you learn when you get locked up is not to ask too many questions. I'd been in for about a year when I was moved to a new cell. My old cellmate, Frank, got transferred, and they stuck me in with a guy named Mike. Mike was quiet, kept to himself mostly, but there was something about him that felt off. The first night in the new cell, I was assigned the bottom bunk. As soon as lights went out, I felt something strange, a chill, like a cold breeze brushing over me. I figured it was just the old ventilation system, but then I heard a faint whisper, almost like someone was muttering under their breath. I thought it was Mike at first, but he was sound asleep in the top bunk, snoring softly. The whispering continued every night. Sometimes it sounded like a woman's voice, other times a man's, always too faint to understand. I tried covering my head with my pillow, but it didn't help. The voice seemed to come from right beside me, like it was speaking directly into my ear. I asked Mike if he heard anything, but he just looked at me like I was crazy and told me to mind my own business. One night, the whispering stopped. I should have been relieved, but the silence was worse. I could feel a presence, like someone was standing right over me, watching. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt that chill again. It was like the bunk itself was alive, breathing with a cold, unsettling rhythm. I finally got up the nerve to ask one of the guards about it. He gave me a strange look and said, "Didn't they tell you? This cell's haunted." Last guy who slept on that bunk went nuts, swore he heard voices every night, ended up slitting his wrists in the middle of the night. Bloodstains are still under the mattress if you look close enough. I didn't believe him at first, but when I got back to the cell, I lifted the mattress and saw them, dark, rusty stains on the metal frame. My stomach turned. I wanted to move to the top bunk, but Mike wouldn't switch with me. He just grinned and said, "Good luck, buddy." That night, the whispering came back, louder than ever. I couldn't take it anymore. I tried to cover my ears, but it was like the sound was coming from inside my head. I could feel something cold wrapping around my wrists, squeezing tighter and tighter. I screamed for Mike, but he just stayed in his bunk, laughing quietly to himself. The guards found me the next morning, still in the bunk, my wrists bruised and bloody like someone had tried to hold me down. They moved me to the infirmary, and I begged them not to send me back to that cell. I told them about the whispers, about the cold hands, but they just laughed it off as another inmate losing his mind. I never saw Mike again after that. They moved me to a different block, but I still hear the whispers sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet. I try to tell myself it's just my imagination, but deep down, I know better. I know that whatever was in that bunk is still out there, still waiting. And I know that one day, it's going to find me again.